Our ancestors made sense of reality by telling each other stories of their gods.
This is our attempt to bring those tales back to life.
I, Kronos, was beseeched by my mother to save the world from the tyrant Uranus, my father. Thus, I took action. None were willing to strike the final blow but I, and none had the right to strip him of his power and take it for their own but I. He begged me to stop, used all sorts of words and trickery to stop me from defeating him. But with his gaping wound and lessening power, I looked down upon him and felt ashamed I was ever afraid of him. Once he had fallen, simply a whisper on the winds now. There was an empty space at the head of the universe, a vacuum that I was all too happy to fill, and there was no one else who could. I now possess more power than any my siblings, even my father, had ever known. The world was mine to rule, to bend to my will. It was all mine. Oh, the endless possibilities, and who could stop me? My elder brothers and sisters were nothing compared to the puissance I now controlled. Gaia, my mother, asked that I release the children Uranus imprisoned. But why should I? They were ugly, brutish things. Nothing like my siblings and I, we titans. Why should I share the rewards for my bravery? I refused her. This was my kingdom now, and she could not command me any more, and I would not have them staining my new lands. I made us a new home, a fortress and court to fit the power I now wielded, a place for us to rule from the high peaks of Mount Othris. And with the tyrant gone, we revelled, enjoying pleasures that our parents had kept from us, doing what we wished, wherever and whenever we wished. My elder siblings now bowed down and praised me, as I deserved. Night after night I held feasts, and everyone would sing my praises. But my father's words did whisper, haunting my mind in the dead of night when alone. I ignored them, the lies of a foolish, desperate creature. I would not be held back any longer by them. Oh, what fun we had! But when Rhea changed, glowing with pride, she spoke of a child growing within her womb. Our heir. A child to succeed me. My blood went cold, for my father whimpered in his last moments. What I had done would haunt me, for he said I would suffer the same fate at the hands of my own offspring. I remembered life then, without the unmatched power I now wield. As I looked down at Rhea's belly, that had barely begun to grow, I felt a moment, a flicker of the power I had claimed, waning. I smiled to her face, of course, but my mind was flooded. The old man's lies could not be true, surely. But I would not give up what I had fought so hard for. I hunted, drank, created, and destroyed what I wished, distracting myself. For as Rhea and the child grew, so too did the words of my father, Uranus. Whispers turned to words, turned to shouts, and became harder to block out. When the time came, Rhea struggled for hours, The screams could be heard throughout the mountain. I sat on my throne and ordered everyone to leave me. The courtiers, my godly brothers and sisters, they did not linger. They vanished quickly so as not to invoke my anger. As I sat, my mind began to play tricks on me. It filled with images of the walls crumbling and my very mountain, Othris, falling into the earth. When I heard Rhea grow quiet, I walked to our shared chamber, and there was the vision before me. A baby girl, glowing in the light of the rising dawn, naked, perfect, and screaming. When the nymph held her up for me, my eyes met hers, and in her reflection I saw myself. But I also saw blood. My blood was pouring from my body. I saw my own downfall, my own imprisonment in her eyes. The images faded, and I was just staring at this writhing child. The panic that had haunted me filled every ounce of my being. With all the power of my father, my dominion over all, and this child was making me afraid. With every breath it took, the fear grew. I could not stand it. I would not stand for it. I had no choice. To keep the peace, to secure my reign, to make sure another betrayal would never come to pass. I held my firstborn daughter in my hands. I turned away from Rhea as she mused on naming her Hestia. I used my powers, and with a quick crack, unhinged my jaw. I shoved the writhing child in my mouth as quickly as I could. She wriggled and kicked at my throat, screaming at the warm, wet saliva as I swallowed her down whole. And then the cries were gone, and the weight, the all-consuming fear that had gripped me these past months, disappeared with her, with Hestia, and all I felt was relief. I dropped the blanket that held her. Rhea's words were desperate and scared, but I could not hear them. I was free once more. I told her it had to be done, that we would be safe for all eternity now. It was necessary. But she screamed and howled, refusing to see sense. I left her to mourn, for she was too emotional to see what had to be done. It did not matter if she could not see reason, to see that I had saved us all. I had done what had to be done, and I did what had to be done every time it had to be done. For she, Rhea, did not and would not understand. So I had to order her to be watched when she fell pregnant again and again and again. I swallowed down the would-be usurpers, every single one. 5 attempts have been stopped. 5 children absorbed into my being and trapped. And now I watch and wait for the 6th. Rhea will birth the beast, and I shall stop him before he can plot against us all, against me. It is as simple and predictable as clockwork. I, Kronos, am sated. I am calm, relieved. Another child devoured, another threat mitigated. Another usurper held within my mighty stomach for all eternity. And I shall continue as I should. The cycle is punishing, but only for Rhea, as she will not bend to my will. She will not stop her carping and whining and crying when I do that which I am fully entitled to do. I merely avail myself of my right, for I am lord of all. I see the hatred in my wife's eyes, yet I will change nothing. It changes nothing. She, like all of reality, all that is or ever will be, is mine to do with as I wish.
Five children, our children, no, my children. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, my sweet baby girls. Hades and Poseidon, my brave boys. These are the names I had chosen for them. The names I whispered and prayed for every single night. I could not leave them nameless, for then I would truly have nothing. And now, my next child, safe while still inside me, but I am running out of time. Kronos has his whole kingdom watching me whenever I am pregnant. I resigned myself to the fact that he could not be stopped. Kronos was too powerful. No one would dare rise against him. The frustration, the grief, and the despair consumed me. I had let myself become hollow. But not this time. I have done this too many times. I know his power. I know his tricks. And finally, I think I know someone who can find his weakness. Gaia, the earth, our mother, for she had faced an all-powerful brute before. She had taken down a tyrant once, and she had raised the one we currently face. Perhaps she could help me do it again, and in turn, save my child. My mother is the very ground beneath our feet. She sees and hears all, but I could not speak of what to do without being caught for treachery against my own husband. I devised a plan to talk to my mother alone, for then we might speak freely. I slipped away from one of the usual festivities the Titans held. They indulged in ambrosia and nectar, foods and wines of the gods. Their potency is too much for any mortal, and enough to make them drunk, to dull their senses, enough to sneak away unnoticed. At the peak, with dances of nymphs, dryads, and nereids. When all the satyrs and sea creatures were their loudest, I disguised myself and ran. No one would notice if I was gone for a day or two. The effects of the wine on Mount Othris would ensure my safety. I went to distant caves, deep in the earth, on a far-off island. I wandered down the winding paths until I could hear nothing of the world above. And in the dank darkness, I placed my hand on the stone wall and called to my mother. In a moment, I felt her eyes and her presence. Her very consciousness shifted to me. I felt her all around me, and she vibrated lowly under my fingertips. Her voice echoed from the dark depths around me. She knew why I had come. She knew everything already, of course, for she is everything. She had watched her children. She had seen my sorrow, and she had felt the sting of Kronos' betrayal to her too. She had watched with her own woe as her prized son became like the monster he'd helped defeat. She soothed me. She had tried to help me with the pain of each lost child and reminded me of my bravery in coming to her at all. She promised to do everything in her power to help us. With our combined knowledge, we came up with a plan, weighing the different options and obstacles we would have to face. I had thought on this for months, for years, for it had to be perfect. A plot I had faith would work, for she had plotted against unmatched, unbridled power before, and she had won. I went back to his kingdom and waited until we could take action. Another indulgent festival was being prepared throughout Mount Othris when we began our plan. I was a few weeks away from giving birth, but with the whole of Kronos' court watching me, he felt no need for extra guards. I acted as I normally would, fearing any deviation from the norm would stop us in our tracks. My mother's consciousness was more present on the mountain, but that was of little regard, as she often focused on us when celebrations were occurring. It raised no suspicion, but feeling her presence gave me strength and courage in the face of what was to come. Once the feast had begun, they all fell into their usual rhythms. Drinking, dancing, gambling, wrestling, and sporting or material contests, consuming glass after glass of sweet ambrosia, nectar of the gods. Groups of nymphs and satyrs joined together to play music, the air filled with laughter and drunken roars of excitement. It was easy to sit and watch. I made sure I was seen drinking. A verifiable hoard of empty cups was strewn on the table before me. The contents never met my stomach. The plants beside me, however, were well watered, and so I feigned intoxication. I made a show of finishing another cup and stumbled when I raised from my throne. An attendant quickly grabbed my arm and steadied me. Kronos looked to me from his crowd of sycophants. He whispered to Hyperion, and in an instant Hyperion was coming over to me. He took my arm from the attendant, asking for my health. I laughed in his face heartily, pushing out of his grip and making a beeline for the wines once more. I knocked on a table hard enough to look like an accident whilst protecting my stomach. A crash of glasses and plates hit the stone floor and brought all attention to me. The last cup I had poured salted water and a few herbs. They worked quickly, and I vomited all over the floor. All stood aghast, shocked by this occurrence so early into the feast. Kronos glared at Hyperion, and he came to my side once more. He put his arm around me as he guided me to my chambers. Hyperion ordered a nymph to stand guard outside and bid me rest well. But she was only a nymph, a lesser being. She would be no match for my illusions, for am I not a titan myself? As soon as I was left alone, I rushed to the window. Mother had grown a set of sturdy vines from my ledge all the way down the mountain. An ideal route of escape. I hurried as best I could. The first step of the plan, executed to perfection. I felt more confident with each step down the makeshift rungs. Finally, within the cave on an island not too far off, but with enough distance from the great feast held on the mountain, I felt a small portion of my mother's presence, for as she attended the feast, so too did she watch over me. Spreading her consciousness into two places was simple for her, and having eyes on both situations would alert us immediately to any fault in our plans. Once I was deep enough in the caves, I sat down and waited, and before me the earth opened. Bowl of frothing dark liquid rose from the mud. I heard a whispered voice in my head.
Drink now, child, and together we shall save them.
I took a deep breath and swallowed the liquid down as quickly as I could. A bitter taste coated my tongue and throat. It did not take long. Small ripples of pain began in my abdomen. I clutched at my stomach, fearing for my child. But my mother's voice rung through my head once more.
Do not worry. It is working.
It started slow at first. It then built up, sharper, harder, quicker, thicker, raging through my lower parts. It was time. I felt it then. I felt him. I had to push him out, but I feared making any noises for the wrath that would rain down if Kronos knew anything. He could drag us back if a single sound was heard. Back to the prison he calls a palace. I clenched my teeth together, but it came on stronger. I bit into my lip, so hard into my own flesh blood dripped down onto the ground. My mother's voice called in my mind. I was not alone. I thrust my fingers into the dirt, and the mud and sands shifted to become like hands. My mother interlocking her figurative hands in mine, fingers holding, squeezing my own. Outside the caves echoed a noise, heard faintly in the depths. The drumming of feet, of swords clashing, shields banging, and fear shot through my pain-riddled body. What if he had found us? But a warmth around my hands grew. Mother whispered of our creations. In our hands joined together, we shifted the mud and made soldiers to defend us, who were the Kurites. They bashed their shields in a steady rhythm now. As the pain grew unbearable, fire burst, sweat poured from my skin, and I pushed. Feeling the head start to release from my flesh, the earth under me moved to cradle it. My mother called in my head, telling me to breathe, and the drumming guided me. I pushed and clenched. My lungs burst with the urge to scream, but together we brought him into the world. His cries were covered by the noise outside. I picked him up from the soft green earth that cradled him, to hold him in my arms, as I had done with his siblings. But I finally felt relief. My mother told me to rest a while as the celebrations on Mount Othris were proceeding for hours longer. Everything was according to plan. I slept with my babe in my arms, my son, the mighty Zeus. When I awoke, he was sleeping on my chest. I studied every inch of him. I admired his hands and his tiny feet, his soft features, the way he smelt. Everything I could, for I knew I then had to move quickly. My mother Gaia had already summoned the nymphs and the goat to take care of my son, Zeus. They awaited me as I woke. I placed him in the arms of one of our most trusted friends, and I knew my mother would watch him with vigilance. But how my heart ached to be parted from him, to not know when I shall see him again. I desperately hoped this was the right path, though it felt so wrong in my core. Zeus cooed in the nymph's arms as I took a stone as large as he. I took mud from the ground and began to make the little arms and legs of my counterfeit Zeus. I took the blanket from his berth and wrapped the replica figure of him. Taking my fingers and reaching them into the mud once more, my mother shifted herself and formed to hold my hands as she had done before, and together we placed a charm on the stone. Focusing on the first moments of my son's life, the stone began to cry, exactly as he had done, his voice screaming out from the heavy rock. I moved back to Zeus with the nymph. Taking him in my arms one last time, I kissed his forehead, gave him back to her, as I replaced him with the replica in my arms. The hard stone, cold and empty, nothing like his warm body. It made my insides ache, my heart growing colder against the stone with every step I took back to Mount Othris. I cried in my chambers, with the stone in my arms. It wept with me. We wept together. Not long after I climbed back in, I staged the room, grabbing animal blood, water, and I stained the bedsheets. I doused myself in waters, painted my legs with blood, and dabbed it over the stone and the blanket. We did not wait long, as there were guards at the door. My husband, king of all, lord of Mount Othris, had been awoken. I heard the steps in the hallway, steadied myself, and clutched the stone to my body, blocking all view of the simulacrum. In a few moments, my son will be safe. Then Kronos himself burst into the room, the doors crashing against the walls, and my heart leapt into my throat, real sweat joining the facade on my face. He looked at me with firm but tired eyes, scrunching his face in annoyance at the ear-piercing wails. He marched to the bed, towering over me, casting a shadow over us in the dawn light, but I did not fight him. When he took the fake from my arms, he opened his mouth and hastily swallowed it down just to shut it up. He sighed with relief as it fell from his throat into the chasm of his stomach. Tears spilled down my face. I had to stop myself from crying with joy. Oh, I finally felt the relief I suspected he did. I turned away, crying into my hands. The all-powerful Kronos swept out of the room in triumph. Once the door was shut, it was over. My son, my youngest, my Zeus, was safe. I had tricked my husband, and in the fullest of time, I would win. The footstep to his doom now grew away from his hungry, spiteful gaze. I, mother of all, Gaia, see everything goes according to plan. And now the real work begins, for what my daughter, Rhea, has provided me with is an opportunity to perhaps correct my past mistakes. I would have to be more careful this time. This radiant child is the key. The 3 nymphs are guided by me. They feed my grandson, Zeus, with the milk from the goat Amalthea. His tiny hands would grab at her fur as he suckled. Adamanthea, Adrastia, and Ida all cared for him as he grew from babe to child. They fell in love with the angelic boy as easily as breathing. For as he discovered life, the world and the creatures within it, a soft, loving nature was revealed. He was always sweet and kind. Even when his great strength was unknown to him, he cried when he broke things. He would beg forgiveness and try to wrap the minor wounds the nymphs received. He would try to hold back his strength, but soon forgot again. Once, when chasing the goat in a game, he grabbed at her horn, but it broke off in his hand. He held the goat as he cried, trying all manner of plants and muds to try and stick it back. He apologized again and again for a week as he failed to return it to its place. Even though the goat felt no pain, he wanted to make amends. I have forged weapons. Kronos was the greatest weapon, but he fails in leadership. He lacks respect. He does not care for his family, for he is all too consumed in his father's power. Why should he have to care for others? He is the center of our universe, and yet he wastes his power on indulgence, on his fits of anger, on his whims. He became so self-absorbed, he betrayed me, his own mother. My grandson Zeus will be taught differently. Yes, I taught him to fight, how to strategize, and to control his incredible godly gifts. But I too showed him forests, waters, mountains, jungles, deserts, wildlife. He would be disguised when we would venture out into the world, and so I showed him all the wonders of Mother Nature. All my creation, his grandmother, and he grew to love me. But he was not ready yet. For this I began to feed him ambrosia. The food of the gods made him grow quickly. But he was still a child, and we were running out of time. Still, he was no match for my son, the tyrant, Kronos. I loved my son, but perhaps he cannot truly love anything but himself. Little Zeus grew up with the world, I alone, as his home. The Kurites helped him train, and he learned how to fight, from singular enemies to overwhelming hordes. And he learned swiftly, not just of the creatures, but how they think, how they work. He knows how they hunt, and soon he fights with the power and knowledge of the entire earth. He practiced over and over, relentless in his own perseverance. He is disciplined in his craft, and in doing so, he enhanced his powers. He easily thought of new ways to use them in battle, always ensuring he gained the upper hand. The Kurites loved the boy, holding back to stop him from harm when he was small, but now they had to throw their full force to contend with his growing power. Now he is grown some. It was right that we talked of Kronos, the king, his father, and of his aunts and uncles, the court he would have to face. I had sheltered the child with metaphors and abstracts of a great evil we had to hide from, as he learnt of his grandfather before him, of how they had failed not only their family, but our world. I saw a change in him, for he had trained to grow his own strength, to see what his own powers could achieve. But an anger now possessed him, as he finally knew of his lost siblings. That he was the lone survivor in a long line of his father's victims. He was eager as we began our plans to fight back. His mind is sharp already, though fresh and untouched by battle. He would soon be a match for my son, the king, to face him and stand a chance. A man now stood before us all, strong and fierce, with a fire in him that would serve us well in the fight ahead. My daughter and I had saved Zeus, and now he would save us all.
Rhea has spent these years testing other courtiers, feeling out their loyalties. And of them all, many were afraid of the almighty power of Kronos, but a few may bend. We took our time and planned once more. The last plot had succeeded in its precision alone. We could not fail then, and this time there is an even greater risk. I brewed potion after potion, for this was instrumental to our plan. For if Kronos was not weakened, we would not stand a chance, even with the might of young Zeus. When it was finally ready, I watched as the child packed. The leather water skin containing the potion hung at his side, along with his sword. He looked at the cave of his childhood one last time, and I knew he was ready. But I could not help but wonder, had I got it right this time? Would this once sweet child survive what he must do? Would he save us from my last creation? My last failure? Would he become another failure? He left the caves behind, a man beginning a perilous journey. Metis met him, and together they made their way to Mount Othris, all under my watchful eye.
I am Zeus. The sounds of horns, lyres, and lutes rang from the mountain-top fortress. Nymphs, nereids, satyrs, and all manner of creatures I had learned of, were all making their way to the mighty palace of my father, Kronos. It was easy to blend into the crowds with our hooded cloaks, as Metis led the way. Smells of rich meats, breads, and wine all wafted through the air. Drumming and choruses of voices grew louder as we entered the gates. My heart beat faster as we entered the domain of my father, my foe. I pulled my head further down over my face and wiped the growing sweat off my palms. Polished stone, vast halls, rows of tables were all being laid out in preparation. I had never witnessed anything like it. It was beautiful and overwhelming all at once. I stared at everything I could, trying to mark all exits, before Metis pulled me into a winding corridor and down into a dark storeroom. There I took one of the attendants' uniforms from the shelf, then dressed and hid. I waited for hours, listening to the music from outside, sharpening my sword over and over. I wondered what he would look like. Of course, Grandmother had made statues of his likeness, moulding the mud to become like his face. I had destroyed hundreds of these things in my years of training, but to see the real thing, standing and breathing before me, would he look the same? I secured the potion to my hip, concealed by my robes, and when the door began to open, I pushed myself against the farthest wall. I watched the stranger from the gaps in the shelves between bowls of figs and olives, but they did not look in my direction. The hooded figure shut the door quietly behind them and stepped forward hesitantly, squinting into the darkness, searching. I ducked lower, but then heard a soft woman's voice. I stood and turned to face her. Her eyes filled with tears as she closed the gap between us. She hugged me tight in her arms, and when she pulled away, her hand came to caress my cheek. Her warmth reminded me of a distant memory from when I was very small. She still smelled the same. I grabbed the hand on my cheek and held it tight, and she kissed my forehead as she tenderly stroked my hair.
My son, I do not have long, but I had to see you again. And look how you've grown. I love you, I always have, and I always will. My biggest regret is that I could not be there to watch you grow. But none of that matters now. I am so proud of you, my Zeus. I'm sorry for what we had to ask of you, but after today, you will never have to hide who you are again. My son.
Her laugh was quiet and restrained, touched with sorrow. She kissed my forehead again tenderly, and then we heard footsteps. She pushed me to hide in the shadows, wiped her tears, and quickly made her way out of the storeroom. I let go of the breath that I had been holding. My heart thumped through my chest as she left me alone in the shadows. An hour or so later, the feast was in full swing. Crowds of cheering and laughter echoed down into my storeroom. Metis soon knocked on the door and drew my hood once more. It was time. I took a tray of chalices and weaved through the hall, observing the hordes. There were clusters dancing in groups, Titan goddesses amongst them. Others were feasting, giving in to their gluttony. One large group had 2 warriors fighting in a makeshift ring, the spectators exchanging bets and cheering at the sounds of bones cracking under meaty blows. The arbiter of the fights was clearly another Titan, but I knew not which of my uncles it was, not then. But his eyes lit up as one man fell and spewed blood over the marble. The larger of the 2, his son, was victorious. The grins on their faces were enough to send a shudder down my spine. As he raised their bloody hand high in victory, the crowd roared around them, and the gold tray of chalices which I held began to dwindle as I approached my target. At the head of the room, sat on a throne above my mother. There he was, the mighty Kronos. He looked more tired and weary than I had imagined. Nothing like the unmatched power my grandmother foretold. His eyes watched all in the room with a vacant, bored expression. The cup I held beneath the tray shook in my hand as I drew closer. As a last normal chalice of wine was snatched from my tray, I moved the fated cup to the center. I stood to my own father's left, my mother remarking on the next fight that Iapetus called for. Atlas, the ruling champion, pounded at his chest, and Cronus was distracted enough to simply pluck the cup from my tray. He ignored the fact that I was even there, exactly according to plan. I slipped back into the shadows, drawing my hood close as I watched him take the cup to his lips, drink it down in one, and toss the cup behind him. It clattered to the floor, and each echo of metal on stone felt like a ring toward victory. He pointed at the beaten body on the floor and laughed. He took my mother's hand in his, and she smiled. Suddenly, his face changed. Sweat erupted on his brow. He clutched at his stomach, breathing heavily. My lips twisted into a smile of my own. I watched as he squirmed on his throne, knowing that the potion we gave him was taking effect. At that moment, he was experiencing abdominal pain, light at first, coming and going in waves. All that showed was a mild discomfort, but soon it grew. His visage contorted for minutes at a time. His whole face began to turn red. He was experiencing contractions in his stomach. How poetic. Soon they were burning through his body. He suddenly screamed at a nearby attendant to bring him something, anything, for the pain in his belly. but it was too late. He stood and raised his hand. The room all quieted for their king, and all he did was pant. He boomed out, "Poison! Trickery! Treason! Who has?" and curiously stopped. Then he lurched forward, folding in on himself, and we all waited. His face as white as a sheet, his other hand white-knuckled gripped the side of his throne to keep him from falling over. Spittle dropped from his open, panting maw before an explosion of chunks followed. It spattered onto the floor and his feet, the whole court in shocked silence. He tried to speak again, but more spewed out. Then he coughed and hacked, and a rock smacked onto the marble. The crowds backed away from the growing puddle, but stared at the strange object. Between his gagging, he finally choked out, "Who has done this to their king? Who has betrayed me?" He tried to speak again, but more spewed out. He returned to retching and heaving. Then, with his next wave of vomit, his jaw opened further than the body is usually possible, unhinging and stretching to a godly extent, and hands burst from his throat, grabbing at his mouth, pulling at the corners. Kronos clawed at his belly, tipping his head down to the floor further, and choking for air. His throat convulsed, and there was a fully grown man expelled from his gaping mouth. My brother Poseidon slowly stood from where he had fallen. The crowds all gasped and began to shriek at the show before them. Kronos was on a roll. Now that he had started, he could not seem to stop. He heaved and cried with pain, his throat contracting and releasing, slowly, painfully, unwillingly, squeezing the fully grown gods out of his stomach. I stepped out from amongst the crowd, drawing back my hood. "Gods, goddesses, mortals and immortals alike, look upon your omnipotent king. See what I have done to him. See, he can be weakened, for he is not unmatched in power. I am here to show you that there is a different way than following this oppressor, and I will restore this once great family to honor. I will rid us of this failure." "Impossible!" Kronos gurgled and groaned, before coughing once more, and two more fully grown gods fell at my feet. Another man and a woman. Poseidon held Hades to his feet, and offered my hand to Rhea. Even covered in muck, she was so beautiful. "I am Zeus, and I am the son of Rhea and Kronos himself. You were tricked long ago, father. The rock you see on the stone is what you swallowed years ago. I am here to save my siblings, those held down by Kronos, those who have fallen out of favor. You shall be restored and honored once more. If you fight in my ranks, I promise you shall be spared. Join me, and you shall live in my kingdom when I smite the tyrant into Tartarus." I had parted the crowds, imploring them as I stood between them and my three siblings. Kronos heaved, his entire body covered in sweat. The blood had drained from his face even further. Horror was in his wide eyes as no one moved a muscle. They were struck still in shock at the sight before them. The stone arm of his throne cracked as he squeezed it. It crumbled in his hands, and the pieces fell like dust to the floor. "Seize him! Kill him! And you, my wife!" He turned to Rhea, fiery rage in his eyes. He stepped towards her, the stone floor denting with each step. She rose from her own throne, raised a hand to cover her face, and scrambled to get away from him. He retched once more, and cried as his jaw was forced open, and the last two goddesses fell at our mother's feet, the last that he had consumed. I looked back to the crowd and saw 5 Titan men making their way toward us. Flanked by lesser beings, they made moves to surround us. I drew the hidden sword from under my disguise and stood my ground. Poseidon stood beside me, a floor-length torch as a makeshift weapon. Chronos and Rhea came from the left, stabbing out at Poseidon. He parried their thrusts, simply trying not to get hit. The bloodied gods from the fights before, Iapetus and Atlas, stood before me. Quickly jabbing and slicing, I dodged and blocked their assaults with my own sword. I was faster than they expected, and I swung under their legs and knocked them to the ground. Hyperion came from the other side in a flash and swung his sword down hard. Our blades met, surprise in his eyes as we matched in strength. But I grinned at him and pushed his weapon away with ease, sending it clattering to the floor. I took a deep breath in, calling the elements themselves. Winds wet through the hall, sending inanimate objects flying. The bright skies darkened as thick storm clouds surrounded the entire mountain. The chaos grew as the guests of the feast all began to scream and run, scattering everywhere. The swathes of guests pushed the mighty titans away from us. My brothers Hades and Poseidon began retreating from the crowds as I pointed to the balcony, our nearest exit and only escape. Kronos watched as his court scrambled. He shouted orders, but no one heard him over the uproar of the winds that were reaching hurricane speeds. Distracted and thrown off, our mother helped my sisters, standing between them and he as they ran to us. Kronos stopped his screams as he saw my sisters slip from his grasp, and I ran to meet them. Just as my father turned back to his throne, in a flash, he had ripped a carved stone from the floor, hoisted it high above his head, his brow furrowed as he struggled, still weakened from the poisons and the potion I'd given him. He screamed as he hurled the throne at us, heading straight for my sisters, their backs turned. And I threw down my sword, shoving my sisters out of the way of its trajectory, and it hit my outstretched palms, forcing my whole body back with the momentum and strength behind the throw. I dug my fingers into the stone, and pushing back at the weight of it with all my might, slowing it down enough to catch it. The triumphant smile on my father's face froze when it stopped in my grasp. I lifted it above my head as he had, but with only one arm. I called to my siblings, my mark to run to the balcony, as there was now a clear path, thanks to Hades and Poseidon. Holding the throne above my head, I was about to throw it into my father's direction, when I stopped, Hyperion and Iapetus pushing through the crowds in pursuit once more, so close they could almost swing at me with their blades. I threw the throne at them instead. They were too focused on my siblings and the crowd to see it. It sent them both flying into the opposite wall, and with that, we all ran to the balcony. Metis pulled a lever as we got close. Wooden benches came down with ropes tied together as an obstacle to any pursuers. It would not hold the Titans long, but that time allowed us to climb down the vine my grandmother had grown to help us escape. All was in place. The darkened clouds made it difficult to see as rain began to crash from the skies in sheets. My siblings and I barely made it to the bottom of the mountain when we spotted the Titans bursting through the wall of wood. They tried to search for us, but we were obfuscated by the storm and would be impossible to track. The rains and trees covered our little party as we made to the small vessel built for our journey into hiding. We loaded onto the ship, and with the help of the winds I summoned, we were gone before they made it to the beach. We had escaped. We knew that they would never cease their search for us. But we were ready. I was ready. Ready for war with my father, and all of the Titans if need be. Or at least, that is what I thought then. I had no idea of the horror they would unleash on us. In what would be called forevermore, the war between the Olympians and the Titans. The Titanomachy. Living Mythology is our attempt to bring the stories of our ancestors back to life.
They explained their universe through the medium of their religions.
Their gods were not distant beings of academic study. They were living, breathing entities
that reflected the wants, needs, good and evil in the very heart of humanity.
We only wish to encourage others to study the deep and rich cultures of our forebears.
We hope you have enjoyed our labours. If so, then do consider liking and subscribing.
If you wish to support improvement in our endeavour, then we do have a Patreon as well.
Until next time, be good to all, but most especially yourself.